The final years of the Moskvich automobile plant, once one of the largest car manufacturers in the Soviet Union, were truly catastrophic. Part of the reason was the systemic problems that had been building up since the Soviet era. But an equally important role was played by the plant's new management, which suddenly decided that Moskvich could not be saved through cheap mass-market cars, but through the business class and near-premium segment instead. And this was despite the fact that throughout its entire history, Moskvich had never possessed either the technology, the reputation, or the experience needed to build such automobiles. The foundation of the company's lineup had always been cheap and compact cars. This was reflected even in the plant's original name, the Moscow Small Car Plant. But the factory management seemed unwilling to accept reality and, with almost manic persistence, tried to transform the dying Moskvich into a premium brand. Naturally, nothing good came from it. But the process of this agony itself, along with Moskvich's final models, turned out to be so absurd, strange, and at times almost surreal that the entire story definitely deserves a closer look. Moskvich engineers recognized global trends and the growing popularity of front-wheel drive and hatchback bodies fairly early. As early as 1974, a mock-up of a new car appeared, internally referred to at the factory as the 2141. Later, it would receive the name Aleko. A year later, the first running prototypes appeared. The project received the name Meridian, and over time, several additional design and layout variants were developed. Even though these were still only prototypes, the engineers had little doubt that the project was already in its final stages and would soon become a production car that would replace the aging Moskvich 412 on the assembly line. But almost immediately, two serious problems appeared. The first was something fairly typical for the Soviet automotive industry: management's obsession with copying Western cars. And while this could still be understood before the war or in the years immediately after it, when the Soviet automotive industry itself was still being formed, by the mid-1970s the situation had already changed. Soviet engineers and designers had developed their own school, and the need for direct copying had almost disappeared. That was what the engineers believed. The bureaucrats did not. By direct order from above, the Meridian project was effectively shut down, and the newly released Franco-American Simca, also known as the Chrysler Alpine, was ordered to be used as the basis for the new Moskvich. The engineers and designers had no choice but to obey. But the second problem turned out to be far more serious. After the appearance of Lada, the Moscow plant was no longer considered the country's main automotive enterprise and began receiving far less attention and funding. In many ways, this was exactly why development of the new model kept being delayed. As a result, the old 412 remained on the assembly line after yet another major facelift, while the Aleko itself only reached production in 1986, 12 years after the first mock-up had appeared. Just as originally planned, it was a large front-wheel drive hatchback. Despite its late arrival and fairly modest technical specifications, the new car was received positively in the USSR, and demand for it was reasonably strong. But Aleko's export prospects were heavily limited, especially compared to the more modern and successful Lada Samara. By the end of the 1980s, the systemic problems that had been building up for years were becoming increasingly visible at Moskvich. The plant's engineering base had long stopped attracting promising new talent. The production facilities had become outdated decades earlier, and the quality of assembly, paintwork, and corrosion resistance was at an extremely low level. The Moskvich 2140, which still remained on the assembly line, looked like a true dinosaur from the past, while the newer Aleko desperately lacked more modern and powerful engines. As a result, even this relatively fresh model continued using old, low-powered engines. All of this, combined with the constant jokes about copying Simca, seriously damaged Moskvich's reputation. The factory management fully understood the critical engine problem and began large-scale construction of a new engine production facility where an entirely new family of engines was supposed to be built specifically for the Aleko. And the most tragic part was that Moskvich's salvation really was very close. But the economy of the late Soviet Union was already collapsing rapidly, and by the time the USSR dissolved in 1991, the new engine plant had still not been launched. The new facility was almost 90% complete, Then came a new era and a new market reality, which Moskvich entered with only a single model, extremely poor build quality, and hopelessly outdated engines. The situation became even worse because of the severe economic crisis of the early 1990s and the effective collapse of the Soviet industrial and logistics system. Millions of workers, engineers, and specialists turned into poor and unemployed people within just a few years. After the transition to a market economy, prices were no longer controlled by the state, and inflation in 1992 alone reached an incredible 2,500%. There are no exact numbers for how many employees the plant had at that time, but estimates range from around 10 to 15,000 people. Maintaining such a massive enterprise while producing only a single model with weak demand was almost impossible. But the Moscow city government stepped in and effectively placed the factory under financial support, funding the enterprise and paying salaries. The main goal was obvious: to avoid mass layoffs. And Moskvich really did avoid mass layoffs. Moreover, for some time there was even enough money left for development. And it was exactly at this moment that the factory management decided Moskvich needed to move into the premium segment. And at this point, some people might expect the appearance of a crazy director who suddenly ordered the factory to build premium cars. But no, this was actually a collective decision, and, at least at the time, one that the factory management considered completely rational. The plant quite correctly understood that Moskvich was rapidly losing its traditional market both to Lada and to used foreign cars. The latter became a massive problem for the entire Russian automotive industry of the 1990s. A 10-year-old Volkswagen Passat, imported from Germany, was often cheaper than a brand-new Moskvich, while also being more comfortable, more prestigious, and significantly more reliable. At the same time, even the constant financial support was still not enough to develop an entirely new platform. Because of this, the factory management decided to modernize the existing design instead. The logic was fairly simple. If Moskvich could no longer compete through mass production, then it needed to sell cars at a higher price and try to turn them into status symbols. To put it mildly, the idea sounded strange. By that point, Moskvich not only lacked any status, its reputation had been almost completely destroyed because of its terrible build quality. But despite this, the project still officially began in 1997. They started with a facelift of the existing Aleko. The car received a noticeably updated exterior, an improved interior, and most importantly, a new engine under the hood. The engine, however, was not Moskvich's own design. The company had failed to launch its own engine into production before the collapse of the USSR. And under market conditions, there was no longer enough money to complete the project, despite the engine plant itself being in a very advanced state of completion. As a result, updated Moskvich models began receiving Renault engines. Instead of the usual numerical index, the new model received the name Svyatogor, after a giant bogatyr from East Slavic mythology. And honestly, the names themselves became one of the few genuinely successful parts of the entire project. Compared to the faceless Soviet numerical indexes, all of this looked fairly unusual and even ambitious. The next model was Yuri Dolgorukiy, an extended version of the Svyatogor, named after Knyaz Yuri Dolgorukiy, who is traditionally considered the founder of Moscow. This car was already aimed directly at the business class segment. Along with increased rear passenger space, the car also received a list of options that would have seemed completely unimaginable for a Moskvich only a few years earlier. But the factory did not stop there. Still in 1997, the sedan Knyaz Vladimir was introduced, named after the Prince of Kievan Rus. It was based on another late 1980s prototype that had never reached production. At the time, the factory management had refused to launch the model without a new engine, and later the Soviet Union itself simply ceased to exist. Knyaz Vladimir was also designed with the business class in mind, possibly even more so than Yuri Dolgorukiy. After all, in Eastern Europe and across the post-Soviet world, sedans were traditionally viewed as far more prestigious than hatchbacks. When the new models were presented to the public, the reaction was mostly confusion. Almost nobody expected something like this from Moskvich. What people wanted from the factory was decent build quality and an attempt to improve the models it already had. Instead, a company trapped in a deep crisis suddenly began presenting cars with ambitions toward the business class segment. For many people, the entire situation looked almost surreal. There were barely any buyers interested in a business class Moskvich. Yuri Dolgorukiy and Knyaz Vladimir cost roughly the same as 10-year-old German cars. And in reality, the Moscow city government became almost the only major customer, especially considering that these projects had largely been developed using city funding in the first place. A small batch of extended Moskvich models was purchased for lower-ranking city officials. Additional cars were sent to the Moscow police, while some taxi companies were effectively forced in a semi-compulsory way to purchase both Svyatogors and their extended versions. It was the Svyatogor that attracted the most public interest. Unlike the rather strange business-class versions, the facelifted Aleko was much closer to what buyers had actually expected from Moskvich. But even here, everything once again came down to the same old problems. Build quality remained terrible, while the price of the Svyatogor, largely because of its French engine, turned out to be too high for true mass market demand. At first glance, the project looked like a complete failure. Huge amounts of money had been spent almost for nothing, while the factory's agony only continued to grow worse. The most logical step in such a situation would have been to change strategy. But instead of abandoning its ideas, Moskvich management decided to go even further. In 1998, an updated sedan with yet another princely name, Ivan Kalita, was presented at the Moscow Auto Show. Advertising brochures described it as the automobile that preserves traditions. The design of the Kalita caused huge controversy back then, and still does today. Personally, I think it was at least interesting, and with time it has even become somewhat attractive in its own strange way. But the public of the late 1990s did not see it that way, and the Kalita quickly became the target of jokes and ridicule. People were especially amused by the enormous plastic radiator grille designed to imitate a Rolls-Royce. At the same time, the Kalita was priced very seriously, around $20,000. For that kind of money in the late 1990s, buyers could already afford not just an old German car, but a relatively fresh BMW or Mercedes imported from Germany. And the few people who actually had that kind of money were the least likely customers to consider buying a Moskvich. Even the Moscow city government, which once again became the project's main investor, purchased only a handful of cars for its own needs after taking a closer look at the Kalita. The number of private buyers turned out to be even lower than for the Knyaz Vladimir. All Moskvich models with princely names were assembled almost entirely by hand, and in very small numbers. The factory survived mostly thanks to the more mass-produced Aleko, Svyatogor, their commercial variants, and constant financial support from the Moscow city government. But even that was apparently not enough for the factory management. The next step became an attempt to enter not the business class segment, but the youth sports car market. In 1999, two coupe versions based on the same princely Moskvich models were introduced. One was based on the Kalita, while the other was based on the Knyaz Vladimir. And the most surprising part was that these were not internal experiments or concept cars. The Knyaz Vladimir coupe was personally demonstrated to the mayor of Moscow, clearly in hopes of receiving new funding, or at least showing where the previous money had gone. And in many ways, these two strange coupes became the final point in the history of the Moskvich factory. Until 2001, small batches of commercial pickup trucks based on Moskvich models were still assembled, after which the assembly line was finally stopped and the remaining workers were dismissed. The exact production numbers of the princely Moskvich models remain unknown. The most numerous of them was the Knyaz Vladimir, with approximately 5,000 cars produced. The rarest models became the coupes and the Ivan Kalita itself. And today it is specifically the Kalita that is valued the most on the collector car market, gradually transforming into a rare and fairly expensive classic car. Mocked during its own lifetime and desirable today, a rather symbolic ending for the entire Moskvich factory.